First and foremost, thank you everybody this evening for making your way for this paper launch. I know it's been a little bit of a task to probably get here because of some of the delays in our transport system today, but thank you for coming nevertheless. My name is Sachin for those of you who don't know me. I'm the director here at the center, and it gives me great pleasure that I'll be chairing this paper launch today. Just very quick housekeeping rules, and then we'll jump straight into it. Phones on silent, please, if you haven't already done so. Feel free to take pictures as you need to. This is being recorded, and this will be available in a couple of weeks on our channel. We don't expect any fire alarms today, so if the fire alarm does go off, it probably is real, and therefore one of our team will guide us out through the back door into the courtyard. And then toilets, out these two double doors, up the steps, one flight of stairs for ladies and two flights for gents. Let me get to tonight's paper launch. So this paper launch, which is in front of you, the executive summary is in front of you, and you can then download the full 60-page, or no, not even 60-page, gosh, it is a almost 100-page paper on interpreting India's worldview, foreign policy, culture, and the civilizational state. I'm sure it's going to be great bedtime reading, this full 60 pages if you want it. But the exec summary is there for you to take, so please do take that with you. This is a paper that has taken the best part of 12 months to research, curate, and produce, which I'm sure Dr. Prabha will take us through shortly. What I do want to say, though, and I'm rather proud of this, that as a center, I think we're the first and probably the only center that is, in a serious way, beginning to think hard about how to interpret India's foreign policy. I don't think there are too many centers out there that are looking at the depth and with the rigor that the center here is beginning to look at, especially through our strengthening democracy desk that Dr. Pedkar leads. So I'm really proud that this paper's come out. I do advise all of you to at least read the executive summary and then get your teeth into the full report. And today's talk, really, I hope we can kind of, I suppose, dig in a little bit deeper and find out the significance and the meaning of this report and why this sort of work is very important. And the other thing I will say is that this is only the beginning of the journey for this report. Dr. Pedkar and Prabha will be available over the next 12 months to come and speak at universities, come and speak at businesses, at other organizations, anybody and everybody who's interested in trying to interpret as India rises, how will she rise, how will she shape the global order, what contribution will she make in that community of nations, and so on and so forth. So I think this is the beginning of something, and not just a milestone of a paper launch. So I think that there'll be a whole array of work around this to come. With that, let me introduce you to everybody. So Dr. Prabha Pedkar is in the center here, and he's the primary author of the paper, a constitutional lawyer by training, Cambridge, LSE in Edinburgh. He's been with the center now for 2 years from the very beginning, and he heads our strengthening democracy desk. So Prabha will shortly tell us about the paper. Next to him, towards me, is David Landsman. David, many of you know, is a fellow here at the ICfS. Prior to that, not just is he a fellow here, but he's also wears multiple hats in, he's a director at the British Foreign Policy Group, also at British Expertise, which is a consortium of British businesses that looks to take his expertise all over the world. Prior to that, an ambassador to Greece. He's also been ex-chairman of Tata Europe. So brings a swathe of experience. I just recently came back from India. So has a lot of experience and a lot of sort of insight. And he's been one of the people that has consulted on this paper throughout. So we're very, very thankful to David to be here and to kind of share some of his thoughts and ideas also with us. And then next to Prabha on the other side is Shurya Dhaval. Shuryaji is based out of Delhi. He runs a fund now and runs a boutique, investment boutique from Delhi. Global traveler. Um, but Shurya has a deep insight into the Indian foreign policy world, especially from some of the think tanks that he advises, he sits on the board of, and has a deep understanding of the way in which India is looking to engage with the wider world. He spends a lot of time here in the UK, in the US. You've been involved in a lot of the Quad conferences, etc. So it brings again a depth of knowledge to this conversation. And also, he's a fellow here at the ICfS, which brings a different perspective to this paper, and also has been an advisor to Brother during the research of this paper. So again, we'll hopefully have a very rich, meaningful conversations. So all three of you, thank you very much for taking time out for this, and let's jump straight into it. Brother, if you can spend just maybe 7 to 8 minutes and tell us a little bit about this paper, the methodology you used, why you think it's important, and what you think we should take away from it in a succinct manner.
Thank you, Sachin. Thank you as well to all those who have been involved in putting this paper together. As Sachin mentioned, it's been a fairly long journey, but we have got there in the end, and it's great to be here. I think it's relatively obvious to say that we're operating in a time where the international order is increasingly fragmented. In such circumstances, if we want to ensure international cooperation, partners need to better understand each other. They need to understand each other's values, their interests, how they approach the world. Engaging with India, especially as India rises, requires all of this. On one level, we have a relatively good understanding of how India operates. We see it as pragmatic. It's strengthening its domestic capabilities in order to be able to engage more widely internationally with strategic autonomy. India is not linked to any one bloc internationally, but is multi-aligned. It will engage with everybody according to where its interests lie. Yet, is that the whole picture? At the same time, we see comments by India's External Affairs Minister, S. Jaishankar, to the effect of India is a civilizational state, or at the Munich Security Conference a couple of years ago. India is not anti-West, it's non-West. It sits in a different category. How do we square these circles? How do we navigate our way through this? That is what this report seeks to address. It provides a purpose-built analytical model of the civilizational state, an increasingly popular concept within foreign policy thinking, constitutional thinking, geopolitical thinking, and analyzes 11 years of India's foreign policy using that model. From 2014, when the Bharatiya Janata Party came into power, all the way through to the end of 2025. The main finding is that India is engaging in some sort of form of ancient cultural signaling in its diplomacy. But this is selective. It's not a comprehensive strategic doctrine, but it should also not be disregarded. Before I go into the specific findings, a word on what we actually mean by civilizational state, this big concept that knits everything together. We have defined it as follows, and there's 4 elements. I'll go through each one by one. The first is claims to represent a group that is defined predominantly by culture or religion, and that's not necessarily resident within one particular territory. So in this case, we're talking about a group defined by a Hindu identity, which in this case can be extended to other Indic religions and spiritual traditions, Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism, and so on. Second, and drawing from that, the state itself is engaged in justifying its own actions by reference to an ancient cultural past. Not contemporary culture, but an ancient cultural past. This is its source of legitimacy, its source of grounding for what it does. Third, civilizational states tend to challenge liberal internationalism, both the institutions of liberal internationalism, perhaps their makeup, perhaps their very existence, but also the dominance of liberal internationalist thinking, democracy rankings, and so on. And fourth, those states assert that based on their ancient cultural heritage, they have a paradigm of indigenous social, political, and economic thought. Methodologically, what we did is we took these 4 criteria and looked through around 650 speeches and official readouts from India's Ministry of External Affairs, applying each one of these criteria, tracking where they were present and not. And in the executive summaries in front of you, you'll see some diagrams with some traffic lights, red lights, amber lights, or green lights. That is our attempt to visually represent those findings. I'll give you a few key highlights from that. First, I think in respect of Southeast Asia and India's engagement with regional groupings in that area as well. There is a strong emphasis within India's engagement with that region on a shared Hindu and Buddhist cultural heritage that stretches back centuries. We see that in particular in efforts by the Archaeological Survey of India, a state-run body, to engage in monument preservation, heritage restoration, and so on in Myanmar, in Vietnam, in Cambodia, cultural exchange with ASEAN and with other regional groups. This we interpret as a soft power first, an ancient cultural soft power first strategy. China, as we know, is a dominant power in that region. This is India offering an alternative. Second headline that we found. Indian officials have stated quite explicitly in some think tank speeches and other multilateral settings that India's domestic nationalism is perfectly compatible with an internationalist approach. In the context of the UN, in the context of India's G20 presidency in 2023, and in the context of the Raisina Dialogues, one of its premier policy dialogue platforms, it's put forward this idea that India is committed to multilateralism because it's part of its culture. And there's often references to a maxim from the Upanishads, an ancient Sanskrit text, to the effect of the world is one family, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam in Sanskrit. So India will engage multilaterally. It's committed, but it's committed on its own terms. The third headline. On the flip side, there's not that much evidence at this stage of India developing culturally distinctive policy alternatives. You see it in India's promotion of yoga, yes. It's the current Prime Minister who played an instrumental role in bringing International Yoga Day to the UN. It's there in terms of traditional medicine in areas, and it's there to an extent in India's lifestyle-focused climate policy. How can individual lifestyle changes facilitate climate mitigation? But in tech policy, defense policy, economic policy, security policy, we don't see that evidence just as yet. And finally, the diaspora plays an important role in India's relationship with the world. Generally speaking, India's relationship with the UK, the USA, the EU is constructed on more pragmatic lines. The diaspora plays some role in that as a living bridge, crucially as an economic contributor in each of these 3 areas, and at a more minimal level, perhaps, a source of soft power, a representation of India's economic ability, India's strength in the modern day. There's an interesting comparison that we found doing this research with these 3 areas and, in particular, Mauritius. Mauritius, for those who don't know, 44% of the population is Hindu. Its population is made up of indentured laborers who traveled there, or taken there rather, in the 19th century. And we see much more extensive cultural links, which I think we can talk a bit more about later and understand how those work. All of this is to say that this civilizational-state model, this 4-stage model that we've set out, we think is a necessary interpretive layer for foreign policy analysts, policymakers here in London and elsewhere in the West to better understand India. We're not suggesting that there is a comprehensive strategic doctrine. In fact, that would be to overestimate, perhaps, a values divergence between India and the West. But it's not something that should be disregarded either. It is practically shaping India's engagement in certain parts of the world that are becoming increasingly important as geopolitical winds are changing. So for the foreign policy community, for the policy-making community here in DC, in Berlin, in Brussels, and Paris. We'd very much encourage you to engage with this model, and perhaps add it to your toolkit, to your arsenal of options for understanding how India positions itself in the world today. Thank you all for being here this evening, and look forward to the discussion and your questions.
Thank you. Thanks, bro. Very, very, very useful. And I think that gives, and I think that the thing that I'll highlight here is the fact that he and his team went through line by line 650 different speeches and talks across different countries in the world to kind of really bring out the nuances of as to what is India actually saying and doing around the world. So I think it's been a bit of a mammoth piece of analysis to get here. David, if I can come to you next. From an ex-ambassador and somebody who understands foreign policy, who has dealt with foreign policy in different shapes, both in corporate and state levels, why do you think something like this is necessary now? And just give us your take on why you are quite keen that actually we do get a better understanding of India and what it's trying to do.
Well, thank you, and congratulations to Prabha and the team for all the work that went into this. I think it's a really useful resource, and I think over the next year or so when you're going out with it, I'm sure you will find a lot of people very keen to understand more. Just a couple of thoughts really from me, sort of turning this on its head a bit first. I think if we're going to if we're in the West, if we're in the UK, but let's say particularly, we're going to understand India, perhaps we've got to understand first where we're coming from, and or at least the sort of instincts which we bring to foreign policy analysis. So I think this is a useful challenge and a corrective to that. I think it's fair to say, from a British point of view at least, we have a tendency to be what we might politely call post-historical. You might less politely call it historically pretty ignorant. But we don't tend to understand the history very much. So we tend perhaps to neglect it. And we also tend, although we are apparently or rhetorically quite attached to liberal internationalism, our analysis of anyone else's foreign policy tends to be quite realist. We assume it's all about interest. So what are India's interests in its region or beyond, or in terms of its tech industry or whatever it might be? So the instinctive reaction is to think forwards, not to look back, to be quite realist, and to kind of assume that anything else is just folklore, just a bit of puff. And so I think to open that up and to challenge all that and to ask it, well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but look at it and understand what is being meant there is quite useful. And onto that follows the sort of second point, which Prabha touched on, which is, I think we do suffer potentially from a bit of a category error around here. Just because India is a democracy, which indeed by any standards I think it is, it doesn't mean it has to be Western. And we tend to think, well, there's a democracy there, it must be kind of a Western democracy, it must be the same values, the same approach. Well, there's no obvious reason why that has to be the case, that everybody who is democratic is somehow Western, and everybody who is Western in some sense that we have in our minds that what being Western is all about, and that is necessarily always exclusively forward-looking, assuming that everyone else is going to end up just like us in the end. So I think it's really important that we understand ourselves in the approaches we take to these things and get challenged by Prabha when we do that without thinking about it. Now, maybe as the West itself is changing, not quite sure how, and I'm certainly not going to try and describe how, but as it changes, in a multipolar world, I think it was inevitable that the West should change. Maybe this will become easier, but I think you're opening up the way, as far as India is concerned, to that conversation, as you say, precisely at the point at which India is rising and becoming one of those great powers in terms of geopolitics that we need to understand. So we better try and understand it, and maybe this is a route into doing that. I've got time for one other point on this.
Yeah.
I think one of the interesting questions, though, is there's a risk in here that we need to guard against of exceptionalism. And everybody does it. So it's universal exceptionalism. I mean, everybody is exceptional. But there are some elements here, it seems to me, that you can compare, or at least you can analyse in comparison with other cultures. Take France and la francophonie, for example. So India goes to some of its neighbours where there is a religious or a cultural or historical tie, and India seeks to build on that. Well, France does that all the time with la francophonie. Good luck to it. Britain does so perhaps a little bit less these days through the Commonwealth, but there are occasions, or at least with, let's say, what we oddly call the old Commonwealth, but the Australias and Canadas of this world, those relationships are very much based on history and a sense of shared culture. There are diasporas, again, India, I think you're very interesting how India uses its diaspora quite selectively. Because if you think, you mentioned I was ambassador in Greece, I mean, Greece is quite good at using its diaspora around the world, probably does so a little bit more consistently or in a single direction. So I think there's a number of angles of this which one can identify, and the danger in discussing any country and any country's foreign policy is that it's hard to avoid being a bit exceptionalist. Well, this is like this and no one else is. Well, no, maybe they are. Maybe identifying where the differences are gets you to what is exceptional and what is, and wouldn't be surprised with a country with the history of India and the size of India and the weight, or at least the future weight of India in geopolitics, if there were something exceptional. But we shouldn't assume it's all exceptional until we've looked at the analysis. So I think there's the real foundations there for that analysis.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That's really interesting. And we're going to pick up on some of this diasporic stuff, I think, a little bit later on. Sure, if I can come to you next. From an India perspective, as she rises, as she engages with the international community more and more on an equal footing, if I can say that, why do you think, or what do you think this paper brings to the dialogue that maybe it would help policymakers in this foreign policy space to kind of engage with India in a more meaningful way, or what's your reflections on that?
Thank you, Sachin. And first, let me congratulate Trevor for really doing a very good piece on India's foreign policy from a civilizational cultural point of view. I say this because I have some experience in working on think tanks for the last 15 years on trying to espouse this aspect of India's civilizational viewpoint into policy making, not just our foreign policy, but in many other aspects of our national policy. So I think from that perspective, it's a really comprehensive piece, because actually even for practitioners like us, it has at times conceptualized some of the ideas that we ourselves hadn't articulated to ourselves. And that's quite a segue into the question that you asked, that, why do we think that from India's perspective, this is an interesting report? Well, let me first put it that at least from India's point, it's an interesting report because it is an articulation from, in some sense, a Western view of what we in India are trying to now tell the world in the last 10 years, that we are a civilizational state. You can define what a civilizational state is from a Western lens point of view, and you can, Trevor has tried to do that, to make some of the characteristics. But from our perspective, we are a state. That is settled. That was settled on 15th of August 1947. But we are a civilizational state, so it is but natural. And Trevor has at times tried to, see that there is a potential, not a conflict, I'd say, but a potential disconnect between what a civilizational view and a state, or the Western view of the state is. But India does not look at it like this. We think that there are going to be aspects of both practical state making, which will be necessary for us to do them, because India is an important player and is going to be increasingly important in trying to engage with the world. So we will have to be practical. We'll have to talk about power dynamics. We'll have to talk about, power projection, etc., etc. But we will bring a huge civilizational lens to it. And so to that extent, this report is very important, because it allows the people whom we are engaging with, people like David and the rest of the people, to actually at least partially start understanding how we are thinking about ourselves and how we think about the world, and how we think. So when we say the word Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, and then or Pravar says that, at times India is not comprehensively on the civilizational track, but in certain areas it has come up with new ideas like yoga or Ayurvedic medicine. He's exactly right. On some areas, we will project our civilizational viewpoint to a greater extent. On other areas, we will project our state interest and priorities on a practical basis, which is necessary. So so therefore, towards the seeming audience, while it may look like a disconnect, I think a report like this helps at least identify how we in our own mind are trying to bridge. And that's why I said this is very important, because even as practitioners, sometimes we don't know ourselves what we are doing because we sort of do it so intuitively.
That's really useful. That's really interesting. That actually, in some ways, this can be a reflection point.
Absolutely. It's like a mirror to us.
For the Indian
For the
policymakers.
Indian policymakers.
And that's really interesting. Yeah. Okay. So I mean, I want to kind of dig in a little bit deeper with all of this. That's all of you have brought in. So, Robert, can I start with you first, please? Can you tell us a little bit more? You touched on it. You mentioned, and the reason why I say this, for those of you who've got the exact same in front of you, there are two examples of how India so differently engages in foreign policy from the civilizational state perspective. One is the UK, and the other is Mauritius. So, in your opening remarks, you kindly mentioned that Mauritius has 44% Hindu population. UK is about 2%. So, but what you show in both of these case studies is how differently India engages with the diaspora. So, in Mauritius, you give in your red, amber, green sort of system that Mauritius most certainly is. India approaches it from a civilizational perspective, right? And it's very, very clear about it. But with the UK, it's a red. So it doesn't take a civilizational approach at all. It seems to take a very statist approach and a realist approach to dealing with the UK and its diaspora. So just elaborate that a little bit for me more. And also, I just want to ask, if, as you say, is correct, that in certain areas India is very much civilization, in others is not, how do policymakers in practice interpret that, right? What is there, and this is a question, is there some sort of decision rule that can be applied with when culture is applied and when pragmatism or realism is applied? Is there some rule there that is being applied? Can you share those reflections with us?
Sure. Thank you for the question. I'll touch on, as you mentioned, the UK and Mauritius thing first. With the UK's engagement with its diaspora, as I alluded to at the start, this is principally, we think, framed in terms of the diaspora's economic contribution. That is the key headline. The diaspora is able to act as a vector, as a vehicle for interaction between British and Indian businesses, British and Indian policy community, and so on. So predominantly economic. There is also a soft power angle that we see in respect of other countries as well. But it's really important to understand what that soft power angle is. That consists of India supporting its diaspora here, showing that, okay, through the diaspora, India is successful. India is rising. India is growing. The success of its diaspora, its professional contributions, its contributions to civic life, to social life, this shows India in a good light to the rest of the world. Mauritius is very, very, very different in that regard. There are explicit comments by, I think, then President of India, Ramnath Kovind, to the effect that India's diaspora in Mauritius, which has been there for several generations longer than the UK, is explicitly a vector for cultural transmission, ancient cultural transmission, and that there are these ancient cultural links between Hindus living in Mauritius, Hindus living in India. How does this actually play out in India's foreign policy? What we see most notably, other than visits by officials to the community, speeches to the community, these references, there's two two fairly recent instances I want to highlight, which I think will shed light on what we're getting at here. The first is a reference from India's Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, following the inauguration of the Ram Mandir in Ayodhya, the Ram Temple in Ayodhya a couple of years ago, and explicitly linking this to the diaspora's faith, the diaspora's spirituality, the diaspora's way of living.
In Mauritius.
In Mauritius. Not in India, in Mauritius. That this is a moment of celebration worldwide. So positioning India and Mauritius as two sites of a globalized Hindu community. Moreover, some of you will have heard of the Mahakumbh, India's largest spiritual gathering. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people gathering around the confluence of three rivers. Sacred water from that confluence was taken to Mauritius and immersed in the Grand Basin Lake, known as Ganga Talao, after the river Ganges in India, by the Prime Minister on his visit. So this is not simply cultural transmission across the Indian Ocean, but this is actually Indian politicians, representatives of the Indian state, acting as active spiritual, cultural participants with the diaspora. So I think we're seeing two fundamentally different things here. And that is shaped by context, it's shaped by history, it's shaped by that engagement. On the decision rule, then, what does all of this tell us? How do we make sense of this? What the civilizational state model does is that it tells us, broadly speaking, the balance between culture and pragmatism. But this isn't a sort of seesaw where you're either realist or you are a civilizational state. We need to think of it in terms of layers. So we see with Mauritius, we see with Vietnam in several respects, we see with some of India's multilateral engagement, that there is typical state behavior, to use Chaudhry's term, typical neo-realist behavior going on, alliance formation, capability enhancement, and so on. But over and above that, and complementary to that, there is a layer of the civilizational engagement. India, by the way, is still forming alliances with Mauritius. It's still engaging with Mauritius from a defense perspective because China is a threat in that region. It has to do all of those things, but it's also doing these other things. So in order to get the full picture, you have to understand this additional interpretive layer.
Yeah. Well, so that's really interesting. So just so I've understood that, and I'm sure this will come up in the Q&A maybe, but what you're saying essentially is that it's not one or the other. What you're saying is that in the UK, for example, it's just being realist and it's kind of remaining realist or pragmatic. But with Mauritius, it's also being realist and pragmatic, but you're actually, there's an added layer that one needs to reflect on. And that's the civilizational piece. That's this cultural transference you're talking about, which doesn't necessarily happen here. What you did say that was interesting, which took me a little bit, I want you to just elaborate a little bit. And I may have misinterpreted it. What you said about the UK bit was that the Indian government almost takes the credit for the work of the diaspora here and says, look how wonderful the diaspora is, and therefore look at India's reach. Is that right? So is that kind of a reverse sort of, whereas in Mauritius, it's actively giving cultural transmission, it's kind of connecting the people back to India. Here it's not doing that. Here it's just celebrating the diasporic success as a standalone.
I think that might be slightly overstating.
Okay.
I think what we see, and to consider that we're going off the official readouts from India's MEA.
Yes.
So there are minimal levels of cultural engagement, but it's not to an intensity that has been recorded. It's not something that has been emphasized significantly. There are small initiatives here and there. But very much it is India's diaspora, whether that is less so international.
Would you consider the Nehru Center here as an expression of that civilizational state, or is that just a realist, sort of pragmatic institution that spreads art and music and culture?
I think it is in the sense that it's drawing on those ancient traditions, ancient cultural practices, but in the grand scheme of things, there is not a huge level of activity going on. And I think just to flag up with the more realist, pragmatic side of this, we've got to remember the diaspora in this country is multi-layered. So it's not only those who have come here from perhaps East Africa or India and settled here, but there are people frequently moving between the UK and India. They are transferring money back to India. So they are, again, part
They're
of that.
investing here in the UK.
Or they're investing here in the UK. So they are part of that sort of economic network in a more fluid sense. And it's their professional success that here, even if they're only here on a secondment for 2 years, for example,
Right.
that then stands for
Right.
India's success globally.
Thank you for that. It's really, really useful. Sure, if I can come to you, what do you think the West is getting wrong about interpreting India and her foreign policy initiatives? And how might this paper, in a practical sense, help us over here better interpret India? So where are we? Where is the West currently getting it wrong?
I think it's a very big question. I wouldn't try to answer if West is getting it wrong. I don't know if West is getting it wrong. I hope they're not getting it wrong. But I think, when sort of, like Prabha is trying to bridge that gap, when the West tries to box India into what is India? Is India a state from their version of a state, or is India a civilization? And is India being authentic when it says it is a civilizational state? Because sometimes you see it acting and articulating, saying it's a civilization, but they're not really coming up with huge civilizational doctrines, and then becoming very practical as a state. So I think the mistake the West could do is to try and, as David also alluded, try and fix it in their version of how a state, a Western state is. I think this paper helps in the understanding or think that you've got to take a wider lens view of India, because as India increasingly becomes powerful, as India increasingly becomes rich, as India increasingly becomes independent of so quote unquote colonized viewpoint, India is going to look back into its history. India is going to go deeper into its roots, and India is going to find out what does really being Indian mean, right? Because to a lot of Indians, India's own image of being Indians is something which has been given to them through years of Western education and colonization. So they will then start to interpret our and go back and project some of these things which may initially be new to Indians themselves, leave aside being new to the West, as I said. So I think it will take, but India is also becoming important. So there will be greater projection. There will be greater Indian diaspora going out. Very interesting point that you mentioned. You said, Indian state takes credit for the performance of the Indian diaspora. Well, in the Western model, that may look like that. But in our model, the state, India takes pride in the performance of the Indian diaspora, whether it is a Mauritian diaspora that may have been gone generations away, or maybe the more contemporary diaspora that may have come to the UK and US. It's when we say India takes pride, Indian state is just a small part of India. We don't look at India as only the state. So so when Indian state takes pride and the prime minister or the foreign minister goes and says we're proud of them, that's fine. He's speaking both as an Indian state and as an Indian, and the Indian state is only a subset of a larger India. But it may be interpreted by somebody like Prabha or somebody in the West saying, why is the Indian state taking credit, as you said, for the performance of the Indian diaspora when Indian state has no contribution to make to that diaspora's performance?
That's really interesting because you mentioned something that so historically, I think both of you have alluded to the same thing. One of the things that the foreign policy community here has made is that we've tried to turn India into a thing that we can understand, right? But is this an organic, natural consequence as Indians rediscover who they are, where they come from, what they believe, etc., and the kind of world they want to see? Is this a natural thing?
Actually, it is the only natural thing, and it is only now coming out because it is organic. What you saw probably in the first 50, 60 years of India's independence was the inorganic part, because that was just continuation of the model that was given to the Indian state by historical incidents of, so it was easier to understand India of that, even though it may have looked independent, a little bit different when India went non-aligned. It was in a block which was given and said, or India's policy was passive. It was still easier to understand India because it was being, or India's adoption of secularism. Saying what does secularism mean? For example, the West was excited when India said we are going to be a secular state. But India's definition of secularism was not the absence of religion. It was the equidistance of state for all religions, because India is a fundamentally, a civilizationally, a religious society. You cannot make religion absent from India. So it's that. But now India will articulate that our definition of secularism is actually quite different from the definition of secularism that was given to us.
Right. So you're seeing this as an organic, natural growth as India, if I can frame it the way you just said it, as India decolonizes itself, rediscovers itself. This is going to be a natural. So we're going to see more of this.
I think
not less. So if we were to do this report, say in 5 years' time, we would see more green lights in the different countries, because you're saying it's going to become more confident in that posture.
Yes. And he's obviously interpreted it in the last 10 years of the BJP regime,
Correct.
or 15 years. I would say that this will be across political classes.
Okay.
This is not going to be a BJP. So if tomorrow there is no BJP government and there is another government, you will see this continuation irrespective.
Okay. That's very interesting takeaway, I think, for us there. David, we can dig a little bit deeper into some of the things that you mentioned. If the civilizational signaling is selective today and instrumental, is it just another tool of statecraft ultimately, or is this a different kind of soft power, which Brother kind of also alluded to in some sense, or does this, as Shaurya just mentioned, it's a deeper long-term shift, right, into how India intends to shape the international order? Is India now sort of, by using this civilizational awareness, connectivity with this diaspora, etc., trying to become more influential on that international stage? How do you interpret this? How do you see this?
That's it. Yeah. As a in parenthesis, I would just say, picking up Shaurya's point, that I'm reminded of some of the conversations I've had about Greece in the past, because the modern sense of what Greece is very much fashioned by what the 19th and 18th and 19th century German and other European intellectuals thought ancient Greece was. So it, again, an attack on exceptionalism. I mean, there are interesting comparisons to be made. But I think, I don't think it is just, I mean, it's not just realism in disguise with a bit of folklore attached to it. Okay. I think there is clearly something else going on here. Interesting question, what model you use to analyse it. Is there a difference between foreign policy proper, kind of pragmatic foreign policy, realist foreign policy relationship with the US, with the UK, perhaps with China, and then something which is actually not really foreign policy at all? It's kind of, what do you call it, community.
Oh, I see.
Cultural policy.
This cultural transference? Is that?
Yeah, well, when we're looking at Mauritius or we're looking at Vietnam or whatever, we're looking at our own communities. And that's not really foreign policy in quite the same way, which might explain why the language is so different. But coming to I mean, and again, another kind of comparison comes to my mind. There are some countries in Europe which look at what's going on in the Middle East, and they say, well, who do we think is right? Who do we think is wrong? What are our values? Where are our interests? And there are others who look and say, what's happening to the Christians? That's what I really care about. And there are different ways of looking at these issues. Are we interested in our people? Or are we interested in our state national interests or our liberal international values or whatever? So there are different angles to look at this. But I think one of the really interesting questions for me, and which is something where civilizational state approach strikes me as really interesting. We're all wondering, I'm guessing, outside of India, as to what India as a great power is going to be like. And the answer is certainly not like the US, certainly not like China, certainly not like whoever the other great powers are. So what is it? And one of the things that strikes me as really interesting, India clearly has interests. It clearly has a strong sense of identity, which I wouldn't dream of trying to explain, but I mean, it clearly does. And yet, one thing that India doesn't seem interested in is changing other people, which hasn't been true of every other great power in history. It doesn't seem to want to make Britain Indian or make Europe Indian, with a possible exception of a bit of yoga. But in general, we are not, we don't see India. So what is India as a great power with increased economic and political weight, more to contribute militarily and otherwise to alliances? What is that going to do? It doesn't seem as if...
Do you have a guess?
No, I'm not really.
Sure, would you have a guess at that? Come on, if 5 years from now, 10 years from now, any government doesn't matter. But as India rises and it hits 8, 9, 10 trillion, right? Let's say, and it begins to get over some of its energy hurdles. What kind of India would you expect? Looking at this framework, I mean, what's the kind of India you would tell us that?
Okay. I also don't have a definitive answer.
No,
but
sure.
I will.
But then the answer is, are Indians aware? Can they answer that question?
But they can answer it in any such evolutionary situation. Answer this in a much more nuanced way with instances in which direction it's going. Right. So I'll try and answer that question in a sort of slightly more micro way to help people, the audience, understand how are we thinking about things in this context. So, for example, and this is interesting because you mentioned in your report China and Russia as including India as civilizational states. Because we have the English language, we're probably more articulate in starting to talk about how we are. I think the Chinese and the Russians also, and I've been dealing with particularly Russia, actually have a civilizational lens. And some of the mistakes that have happened in the West, the engagement with them, is because they have not been able to articulate, given the language barriers, what is their view of their civilizational state. But that was an interesting point that you mentioned, that they should also be studied as civilizational states. But let me give you, from India's perspective, what do we mean? What kind of India do we think? So as a civilizational state, we are powerful, as I say, from Strait of Malacca to the Strait of Hormuz. We're the net guarantors of security, etc., etc. In the Indian Ocean, I run a big Indian Ocean conference, so I know that, we are. But you know what? One of our civilizational doctrine is might is not right. So just because we are powerful does not necessarily mean that whatever we say is going to be right. So India's view of the Indian Ocean region is, of all the littoral states, is that everybody has an equal right in deciding how the seas should be navigated. Equal right. So Mauritius or Seychelles has an equal power than deciding, because the seas belong to everybody. So in the Indian Ocean region, we would like to see open sea lanes, not because it suits our economic interest. 85% of our oil comes through it. We guarantee the economic security, so we will close Strait of Hormuz when we want it, or we'll open it when it suits it. We believe that, and it's difficult to understand it from the Western lens, because the West will say, but if we were in your place, we would have done exactly this, because that's how we look at the world. It's a zero-sum game. Either you win or you lose. Now, in our game, we don't think it's a way. So when we say Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, or we say this, it's increasingly difficult for the West to understand. So that's the direction India might end up. And that's why I think it's interesting when countries like India will be in the Security Council, whenever that changes. Because they will bring actually a different perspective. And they will bring in a different perspective not when they are not players. I'll give you another example. India became head of this, had the G20 presidency. India was the first country that brought the African Union into the G20 presidency, saying there are 1 billion people, and we think that they should be sitting on the table as well. No other member, if you had become part of the G20 presidency, would have worried about the others that were outside the club, right?
That was actually quite a flagship.
Yes. Well, the G20 presidency existed for the longest period of time. Nobody else ever brought the African Union into the presidency.
Interesting. Robert, do you want to reflect on that a little bit, just based on what David said and what now you've heard from Sure, just to kind of wrap that up, and then I want to open it up to the audience.
Sure. I think what I would say is that, especially if we're looking forward, which I think is where we've reached in this discussion. When we're looking back, I think the model that we've developed, it's that interpretive layer to understand almost I see that as our GPS, our sat nav. Now it's sort of stuck on the inside of our cars. Previously, we put it on the inside of the windscreen. But that is our sort of upgraded GPS for understanding what it is that's going to come. So, for example, as things shift in the Indian Ocean region, as things shift in the Security Council, for policymakers here in the West, I think that framework, those four elements, and as is sort of set out in the paper, the much more detailed set of elements that goes into that, I think that can become a valuable analytical tool for saying, for example, India's putting forward this idea of inclusivity. Where is that coming from? Does this have some basis in its ancient culture? Oh yes, they've mentioned this particular text or this particular ruler or this particular element from India's cultural deep past. Okay, we know what's going on here. We're able to now interpret this, and we're able to understand what sort of a power is India going to be. Because I think why this model is so important ultimately as we look forward, and as India goes on the trajectory that Shraddha has mentioned, and starts to engage more with the West and with other partners, we risk one of two things. Either we see the framing of this, we see the behavior, and we think India's not like us. It's something different. We can't engage with it. What's the commonality here? I don't think that's necessarily true, but we need to use the model to understand whether that's the case. On the flip side, you could say, well, this is just smoke. This is just rhetoric. Actually, India is just pursuing its own interests, even when the policies on the table show it's clearly not. So I think this model becomes really important in that context as we look forward to actually navigate our way through what is to come.
Thank you. That's really, really useful. Thank you very much. I think that was useful just to hear it from different perspectives and where we're going with this. I want to open it up to the audience. So please just raise your hand. The mic will come to you. Please speak into the mic, and by all means, tell us who you are and ask your question. So, any questions? Otherwise, I can keep going. Yeah. So, here at the front.
Oh, hi. Thank you. Atul Shah, professor at Bayes Business School, City University. Fascinating discussion and fascinating chairing as well. I've just come from an afternoon of discussion around epistemic violence. Sort of the violence that, historically is defined as that the West has done to many nations of the world, especially, of course, indigenous cultures. So from this discussion point of view, does India have a foreign policy strategy around epistemic, obviously my interest is epistemic non-violence, but around epistemic assertion or transforming the global episteme, the global knowledge, because I'm really upset about the Anthropocene and how, in a sense, the West and Western science has no language or approach which is unanthropocentric in its framing and thinking, which India has. So,
Okay.
thank you. Sorry.
Okay, so I'm going to try and frame that question first to Shaurya and then Prabha. I think
make it less academic because
So I'm going to
I haven't understood myself.
Yeah, no, so I'm going to frame it and then correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah,
I'm going to frame it
language, please.
Yes, I'm going to frame it as essentially you touched on the point that as Indians rediscover who they are, their discovery, they're kind of almost reconnecting with the knowledge of the past of their ancestors and then projecting that into the 21st century, right? Not that they want to go into the past, but drawing inspiration from it. So I think what Professor Shah has just kind of asked is, does India have a foreign policy? But maybe the question would be, does India proactively have an agenda, or in this civilizational state sort of framework, would it have an agenda where it also empowers academia, other thinkers around the world to also reinterpret Indian history, reinterpret Indian knowledge systems, etc., etc. Like, would the Indian state, from a foreign policy perspective, entertain that?
150. It is a civilizational doctrine. So, for example, in India, the Indian state has revitalized and recreated the Nalanda University, which is to ask, because for centuries, from 4th century to 14th century, Nalanda existed in India, asking scholars from all over the world to come for 1,000 years to come and understand India and Indian culture and to understand India, and provided them a sanctuary and an institution which was world class with 14 new library created in every century. It was burned down
And it's just rebuilt.
Yes, with the advent of Islam, they came. The first thing they did was they burned down that entire structure and the entire university, and it always for 600 years it was under the ground. It had become, it disappeared. New India recreated Nalanda University, which is a state initiative. We created a huge campus there, collected all the books and trying to recreate and asking scholars, and it's a state
From all over the world.
From all over the world, actually all from outside the world. So from the different people from different countries studying Indian culture, Indian art. So India would encourage the Western world to act, or the whole world actually, to come and interpret it.
So one would say that as time looking forward, if you were to look at this civilizational expansion or unfolding, if I can call it that, as it unfolds, we will see India engage more and more with foreign actors, foreign centers of knowledge, to also re-engage with Indian history in this new paradigm.
Yes, because when you understand, I'm trying to say, when you understand the civilizational context of India, you will always see that India was an open,
global.
It was not a closed power. It's not an insular power, as you also mentioned in your report.
Right.
It's a reformist power. It believes in the idea of samvad, dialogue. Not yes.
Robert, do you want to add anything onto this?
Sure. I think how I would think of this from a forward-looking perspective, will it undo this epistemic violence or change the global episteme? I think we will see this in applied contexts, and I think it will happen in different contexts, and it will build up over time. One really good example of that, I think, is the G20 presidency of 2023. The theme for that presidency in English was one world, one family, one future. In all the speeches given by the Indian officials, it becomes quite obvious quite quickly that this is India's ancient thought: the whole world is one family, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, with a nice catchy English slogan. But that is where the link is fundamentally coming from. And I think we may well see more of that. Now, the reason why I think that becomes so significant is that India is engaging this in contexts where I think it makes sense for it to do so. Its G20 presidency was an opportunity for it to show its values to the world, to set out its stall to the world. The Raising Our Dialogues, which we talk about in the report, this is India's premier foreign policy set of dialogues. It's not a surprise, really, that it's going, you're going to see an articulation of the Indian perspective in those scenarios. So I think we should see whether more of that happens over time. And I think we may well see that contextually building upon those ancient principles, translating those into modern day instantiations in more different contexts as India becomes a bigger player in the world.
If I may just interrupt, you missed is in that the major conference, which you should do in the next version of your report, is the Indian Ocean Conference, the 10th one, which was actually held just 2 weeks ago in Mauritius, which is run by the foundation I am associated with, called the India Foundation. For the last 10 years, we've been running an Indian Ocean Conference, and give you a perspective of how, which is essentially, actually the 10th one will be in India, where we are essentially, to my point, projecting the idea of Indian ocean as a way of how that ocean existed in the past, and how it was a plane for open sea routes and trade and culture, and preparing a blueprint of what that Indian Ocean region should be in the future. of a region of peace and region of, to which I said where every state had an equal power, equal vote in deciding how it will be governed, which is very different from the official the Indian IOR, region rim state, which is formed by the states, etc., and which goes, very different concept.
That's interesting. Okay, sorry.
Can I just very quickly come in and just actually dovetail with what Shad is saying and kind of zoom out a little bit as well. I think what we're looking for when it comes to this model is one of two things. Either, as you say, how are things in the past? How will they be in the future? This goes to the second pillar of the model. How is the deep past being used to shape the future? And the second thing is a question about values and principles. What are the principles and values from India's past, its cultural heritage, that will be applied in particular contexts in the future? I think these are the questions that we should be asking if we're to better understand, say, for example, how India is shaping that part of the world, how India is shaping other parts of the world.
What about the Confucius Institute example, where China is literally all over the world creating Confucius institutes? Does India have that kind of foreign policy strategy?
Right. So we'll come to that. We'll tackle that offline if we need to. That's an interesting question, by the way. Other questions from other? Yeah. So
yeah. Sam Lewis, former intern here. You've sort of, when you've been talking about this model, you've been talking about it as being sort of, to a certain extent, non-militaristic, if anything, sort of particularly with the sea policy, it being a fairly an aim at promoting peace. But I was thinking about the instances where India has intervened in a conflict which it's not, that it isn't sort of a dispute over Kashmir. So, for instance, the Bangladeshi War of Independence or the Sri Lankan Civil War. And I was just wondering if you had any insights into how India's policy in those conflicts shapes your reflections on this model.
Really interesting, yeah. And also, I just want to kind of talk about, when we talk about peace, whether it's in Indian Ocean or and you can correct the premise if you like, by the way, you're free to, we'll do it. In order there to be substantial peace, there has to be substantial power. Somebody has to be able to bring order in order for there to be peace. So somebody's going to have to play that power role. And I think I just want to dovetail that into that question as well. So, David, would you like to take that first, and then we'll come to Prabha in terms of how do you see you've seen the longitudinal story of India somewhat over the last 30 odd years, many conflicts. How do you at all, if anything, use this model to make any sense of India from a military perspective, a power perspective?
Well, I suppose the more powerful you are, the more confident you become, and this fits also with India's, if coming of age might sound arrogant, but I mean it's kind of emergence from a foreign-inspired model, because then you feel more confident. You're not behaving as though you're always on the defensive, having to protect your interests in a sort of narrow sense. I don't know if that's what you.
So have you seen that? Have you seen that happen over the last 30 years? You've been seeing foreign policy unfold. Have you seen India go from being kind of not parochial, maybe that's too strong of a word, but very regional, to kind of now increasingly being more interested in the wider world?
I'm not sure.
As it becomes more confident.
I'm not sure I've got a rounded perspective on that, but I rather felt that there was an Indian foreign policy or an Indian approach 20 odd years ago or whatever, which was quite diffident in many ways. There was a quite assertive first few years of the BJP foreign policy, and you found, I mean, I wouldn't accuse Indian ambassadors ever having quite been wolf warriors, but there was a bit of that in those earlier years, and that seems to have mutated, as far as I've seen it, which is a small and unrepresentative sample, into something which is greater confidence. We see something which is stronger, more confident, not, the risk of it sounding rather rude, but yapping at anyone's heels here. It's much more calm, confident, which fits with the broader kind of civilizational approach. But it's more, perhaps it's also to do with the fact that India now knows, kind of feels instinctively, it doesn't have to tell anybody it's in the first league. It is in the first league. It's there.
Yeah.
I'd say that's based on an unrepresentative sample of something, but it's the impression I have.
Professor Shore, would you like to reflect on that point about war and power play in this?
Yeah, I think the way in which, from an analytical perspective, I would approach this is to say that the civilizational state model, I don't think, and certainly not at this stage, is going to explain every single aspect of India's behavior. As I said earlier, it's an interpretive layer. Now, it is quite possible I am not an expert on the Bangladesh War of Independence. I'm not an expert on the conflict in Sri Lanka. But it's quite plausible that India might have had state-ish interests for getting involved in either of those two places, whether that is border issues, whether that is trade issues, whether that are, those are the issues for which other states intervene in what other states are doing. So I think I'd say that these two models, these two ways of understanding India, are operating in complement and as two different layers of the proverbial onion, rather than as there must be a civilizational explanation for everything.
Okay. Sure, do you want to?
I think I agree with what River said, that that India will move along the spectrum, and that's why sometimes it's confusing, because sometimes a lot of people understand and look at that India as being sort of having double standards. So how is it that India can talk about democracy, as the Americans say, and yet buy Russian oil? Yeah. Right. Yeah. And support. So this is where the conflict comes, or seeming conflict comes, because India also moves on the spectrum about its civilizational view, which may about be individuals and democracy, etc. But sometimes moves along the spectrum for its state interests. It acts more of a state. So that's what I said. India is both a civilization in the beginning, civilization and a state.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. We have a question here.
Thank you. My name's Sham. I work for a hospital. I just wanted to pick up on what this gentleman said about, for example, the purchase of Russian oil, even though the European Union were buying so much oil and gas. And my question is actually about narrative and the presentation of narrative and the media and, in my opinion, the damage that the media has been doing and continues to do to India, and then impacts on the relationship. So I'll just give two examples. So first one would be the continuous presentation of the media that says, oh, India doesn't look after, minorities or whatever nonsense, right? But they completely fail to ignore that the Dalai Lama has been living in India, protected, safe, and his community can live there very safely and peacefully. And, it's interesting how that is not presented in the media. Another example would be the Zoroastrian community who came over, when they fled persecution from Islam in Persia and settled in India. Again, that is not presented well by the media. They don't present it.
Is your question?
My question is, how do we deal with the media? I mean, this gentleman talked about having, similar to the Confucius setup. So how do we deal with that? Because it doesn't matter how good this is if we cannot present
So I'm
it.
going to just frame that question. I'm going to bring it to David first. I know you need to run off soon. And then I want to come to Brother. Is this report useful for commentators? I know you've written it for the foreign policy community, but media journalists, media editors, I mean, are they misinterpreting India equally in this way? And is this useful for commentators? Or is this kind of begs the question almost?
No, I think it's a piece of work for scholars and for the foreign policy community, from which, when there is a better understanding, one could then hope that, most journalists fly in somewhere and spend a couple of days, find someone who speaks English, get a quick bit of insight and fly out again. That's not fair on all of them. There are some real experts. But I don't think I would plonk this on a foreign policy desk in a media house and expect it to be translated into a useful soundbite on 24/7 News. But I think there's part of a process here, and this is a complicated business. I think it's worth bearing in mind here. This is quite a new frame of reference for certainly for Westerners to be thinking about. We can't run before we can walk on this.
Yeah.
That's my take. I'm going to have to run.
Yes, absolutely, David. So thank you so much for taking part in this. I know you have to run off. You've got 3-4 minutes left.
Yes.
I have nothing to add.
Nothing to add to that. Brilliant. Can I move to the next question? Is that okay? Is that okay? I know there was another hand up. Was there another hand up? No, we're good. Then let me then wrap up very quickly. So thank you so much, everybody, for taking time out to. Brother, congratulations on the paper. I hope this following year you get lots of different roundtables and conversations started on this area. As you can see, it's a nuanced piece of work. It's an in-depth piece of work, and it's the beginning of a process, not the end. So I think that's really important to understand. I do think that this paper is going to be useful in places like Amsterdam. I think it's going to be useful in the US, most certainly. And I think, the more people can engage with this in a meaningful way, the better I think it will be. The final thing I want to say is thank you all for coming. I hope you have a safe journey back. I just want to let you know that we have a K lecture. Our monthly annual public K lectures is on the 20th of May. And ironically, the topic is on just war. So we will have a Buddhist scholar, an academic, and a monk, as well as a Christian theologian who has been studying Christian ethics and just war theory. So both on stage to discuss the idea of just war. So please do join us for the 20th of May if you are around. And let me tell you here, behind you before you go, if you'd like to become a member and stay connected to the center, please scan the code, follow us on LinkedIn, and if you want the full report and you really want a good night's snooze, there's the full report, 100 pages for you to read and devour.